Well, good afternoon. Just thought I'd share what Austin Kleon calls dispatches. Just share what I've been working on this week. So I mentioned in the last podcast that I read Carl Jung's Red Book few times actually. Then proceeded to read his book Ion, which is essentially the phenomenology of the self. As you well understand, if you've listened to my podcast, that's a big part of, Yogacara, Buddhism, Vedanta, Shaivism, and essentially what I'm after, right? The Greek Delphic oracle or maxim of know thyself, right? And I've had to do that myself. I've had to learn how to understand some very basic things to be able to even do that. So, Red Book, Carl Jung. So actually this week, I spent the week listening to Carl Jung's Red Book and Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, because I had that weird belief, and I believe I was 100% correct, because he even mentions it. Carl Jung himself mentioned it when he was planning the Red Book, that he was recommended to do it in a Zarathustra form or an autobiographical form. Arguably, not a lot of difference between the two, especially when you understand the philosophy, right? The unity of opposites, right? The self and other, no separation. The I and other, the self, using these terms a little interchangeably. So what I spent the week doing was listening to Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Again, if you follow my podcast, you know I've read the book countless times. But back and forth, listening to Carl Jung's Red Book and Nietzsche's Zarathustra, you can see within it what I've said before, that Carl Jung was intimidated by Nietzsche because of his language. And you can see that Jung is attempting off and on this what would we call it, aphoratic structure that Nietzsche likes to take, meaning he writes in kind of like an illuminating prose sort of format. He tries to say more in a sentence than some authors will say in an entire book, or struggle to even say in a book. Long story short, the reason why I did this is because Jung did a series of lectures on Kundalini, which is just the energy that you're meant to nurture, prana. Prajna, it can mean wisdom, it can mean energy, it can mean understanding, and depending on how you pronounce it, it can mean breath as well. So it's interesting that it coincides with Jung's idea of the anima, the animus, pneuma. He's mentioned all of this idea of breath, life, energy. Likely got that from the I Ching, because that's where they went and combined breath and energy, right? It's prana and prajna in Sanskrit. In the Asian, it became one. It kind of combined together, right? The idea of chi. And what Jung saw was this synergy, but I don't think he saw how deeply this was all connected. But what he did share was his teaching of know thyself. He calls it individuation. Active imagination is how he gets to this individuation. What that is the persona is what I've explained before, this idea of you put on a mask to others. But and I've explained this as well, you have to look at the Japanese idea of multiple masks, where you even put on a mask for yourself. So you're hiding your true self from yourself. And Jung goes into this, the idea of there's the I, this construct that we hobble together, that we consider the self. There's another one that we try to have others believe that is us, the self, the I. And then he separates that from a true self. I would call it identity of the individual, this collaboration of chittas, even chitta being the Sanskrit word for consciousness. So if you were to collect all these different personas, collect the different chittas, right? This perception of the mind, right? Be it ear, nose, throat, or images, preferences, emotions, all of these collective ideations that we consider the self. You use active imagination to separate what is fantasy, what is theater, narrative, what is true, which tends to be limited, right? Because we like to fool ourselves. But the idea of Jung's therapy is to separate the construct of the self from what is what you would call the fountainhead of existence, right? What do I mean by that? He's arguing, like the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the Atman, we don't really have an independent self. We fool ourselves into believing that we're a separate individual. But what we really are in these philosophies is a divine being acting as a finite being, right? So we have within us our power, what propels us, right? In German, Macht. What propels us is the energy of the Shakti or the Kundalini or the fountainhead, the Godhead, whatever you'd want to call it. But what we have is this collective soul that we share. And we work on trying to individuate ourselves from this collective. So the idea here that Jung was talking about, he said that he had lost his soul, but this idea of understanding one's relation to the universe, right? This is Purusha and Prakti in Sanskrit. So the phenomena of life separate from the existence, right? So Carl Jung's active imagination was an attempt to leave reason aside, and I'm going to get to the reason why I mentioned that, so that you're able to work within sense and nonsense, as he says, because our finite minds will treat the infinite as nonsense. That's where this idea comes from. So individuation is a process of, arguably, I've said it before, this idea of ego recontextualization, right? Separating what you mistakenly believe is you, yourself, independent from the system. Jung believes very much that we are all powered by the Shakti or Dakini, this energy of providence, a divine energy, whatever you'd want to call it. But we're all powered by the same force. And this act of differentiation is actually, I think, partially titled in a dualistic, oxymoronic sort of fashion, because of the duality of non-duality, right? Carl Jung talks a lot about the contradiction of the opposites, because our goal is to blend those opposites, just like Rudyard Kipling's poem. This is why I've said that it is a treatise on Buddhism, on Vedanta, on the philosophy. Because when he says, when you learn to treat triumph and disaster as the impostors they are, that's this idea that Jung is trying to get to. That it's the union of the opposites, unity. Right? So what I've found out is he's turned a lot of people off because he is so focused on the Western canon, right? So the Bible, Christ, Gnosticism, alchemy, from a Western perspective. He was very enamored with the East, I think partially because of the universality of this message, of the archetypes, of the symbolism, but also because it was different, it was strange, it was new. And this is what I was getting at. So this week, the last, I guess, month or longer, when I got into Jung here and really studying him, it was an attempt to see if William James, his philosophy, his psychology had influenced Jung. Because in Jung's philosophy, I hear a lot of William James' radical empiricism, right? Even William James, who wrote about this long before Carl Jung did, this idea of a collective unconscious. I hear all the time how people say Jung came up with this idea of a collective unconscious, the zealot. But did they read William James? I know his radical empiricism wasn't published till after his death, but again, the people he was talking to, this small circle of psychology at the time, I highly doubt this was something that was missed. And considering that when it was published, this was the exact time that Carl Jung was doing his research into this whole field, I argue there is a synergy, a connection, right? So we have this connection of the Upanishads, of Yogacara, of Buddhism, Max Mueller and Hoyer, all of these Germans who translated from the Sanskrit a lot of this philosophy. But the string that I never thought, again, what's hilarious, is Carl Jung got a lot of his philosophy. He even accredits Nietzsche as being one of the first psychologists, but almost all of his philosophy stems from Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's philosophy very heavily influenced by Schopenhauer, who was heavily influenced by the Upanishads. So once again, they're all connected. But what I found shocking is Carl Jung attributes his philosophy and his insights to his mandala practice, or he talks about how the Secret of the Golden Flower, which was a Taoist meditation manual, a little later, and it was what we would call the Xi'an take. So a very wizardy kind of take on this idea of developing your chi to become a powerful individual rather than to embody the will or the Tao of heaven and earth, right? So it's a little problematic, but what I've realized in reading his introduction, now I'm currently desperately looking for Jung's introduction to, so I have his introduction to the I Ching, I have his introduction to The Secret of the Golden Flower. I think I found it all because it was his seminars on the Kundalini, his intro to the I Ching, which I now have. But when you read this, what's interesting is in his introduction for, who translated it now? Wilhelm, I apologize. Richard Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching. He wrote a commentary to, The Secret to the Golden Flower. In his, Carl Wilhelm asked, my apologies, Richard Wilhelm asked Carl Jung to write a commentary to his new translation. This is Wilhelm's new translation of The Secret to the Golden Flower. And in his commentary, Carl Jung supposedly for the first time talked about how he used mandalas to access the active imagination. So I want to go this one step further and say, no, in reality, what he was uncomfortable sharing, because he makes jokes about astrology and how many people do astrology, I think he was ashamed or shy or whatever it might be to admit that it definitely seems like his true, tool to access the active imagination. And here's where I say he went a little further too, because the I Ching allows one to not just access the sense, access the nonsense, right, leaving reason aside. I do believe that I Ching allows one to access both the sense and the nonsense at the very same time. So all of these Jungian scholars think that he got a lot of his influence from Mandala, or it was influenced by the Chinese, the Book of Change, but what they don't seem to realize is it was more than just influenced him, because he mentions in his introduction that he spent years trying to access the I Ching, or he was accessing it, with an older translation, Lege. I've mentioned that I used to use Lege for years myself, because that's all I had access to. And I don't feel it was as limiting as he made out, but what the difference was is Lege was just an academic scholarly work, translating the I Ching. It wasn't an attempt to transmute its actual form and function. So the Book of Change is a philosophical treatise, but it is also commonly considered an oracle, but it doesn't really tell you the future. What it allows you to do is access your intuition, right? This idea of induction. It allows you to access your anima, your animus, your true soul, your guru, as Carl Jung talked about. His character was Philemon, this wise old man who used to come to him. So my thesis, my premise, my take is it was actually the I Ching. The I Ching was what was allowing him to access his intuition, was allowing him to, again, refine his soul, integrate the self and the personas, but more importantly, was his true guide. Philemon, sure, was a character he used for this guidance, but I argue the true guru, the true guide of Carl Jung was the I Ching. And so just to give a little tidbit, what I've come to realize is similar to how Jung was shocked by how much better Wilhelm's translation was in allowing him to access his own intuition via the I Ching. What I realized is in the West, we tend to not use the original method to access the I Ching, which is called the yarrow stick method, which you just take a bunch of yarrow sticks and you divide them up. And the number of sticks left, when they're counted out, that gives you your numbers, right? The numbers give you these lines, either broken, unbroken, changing or not. And I argue because I was able to develop a new way to access the I Ching. I use coins. I've mentioned this before, but I use a very special form. Right? Because remember, we want to encourage yang to move and yin discourage. It's all the way it was designed. So the normal probability of the yarrow stick method cannot be duplicated with regular coin method because it's far too simple. It doesn't allow yang to move as much, and it over emphasizes movement for yin. So this modified 3-coin method, I use a 4th coin just to help mix them up. This modified 3-coin method that I used to say it matches the probability of the yarrow stick method. But that's simply the mathematics, the maths. So the probability is identical between the yarrow stick method and the coin method that I've developed. But here's where we get into the problems of philosophy. The reason why I laugh about objective truth. This is the thought experiment where we try to figure out, and I'm not talking about something that's objectively true when it comes to universal truths, the stuff that we're working towards here. What I'm talking about is the philosophical practice, the thought experiment of what is an objective truth, what could be an objective truth, where you strip from the data set essentially is the human being, right? So in this case, the yarrow stick method, simply mathematically, is, well, it's historically the original method, but it is very, what would you call it? How would you call that? Unique and pure, right, as they would say. And so if I were to develop this 3-coin method that matches the probability by having a special coin, it actually improves the insight. Or does it hinder it? Because here's the question. I always had a problem with the yarrow stick method, because you can bias it by counting into the sticks. And I wonder if my probability is better or worse. Now, I personally think it's better, because since I have adopted this modified coin method and adjusted my faith in the process, I have achieved new levels of insight that I just cannot believe. It just doesn't fit chance. So the reason why I was wondering is because if the probability is such with the yarrow sticks, is it meant for you to allow your subconscious to bias the results? What I mean by that is, if we're accessing some sort of universal guru or our intuition, is it good that our intuition is able to skew the results because that's the guide that you're accessing? Or are we going to take these people at their word? Because again, I've studied this, it's 35 years at this point. Nobody has ever mentioned that you subconsciously bias the results, because the way the yarrow stick method works is you're supposed to divide them evenly, not count, but feel for arguably what seems to be an even division, 1 pile to 2, 1 pile to 2, 1 pile to 2. And no one ever mentions that you're counting into the sticks, because you're not. You're supposed to feel. So that's why I argue that this new way to access the I Ching is beyond incredible. So currently what I'm working on is how did Jung access the I Ching? What was Jung's actual process? Because I argue it is his actual process for accessing his imagination. The active imagination, his individuation was all, I believe, for the most part, not based on what he talks about the mandala, which is a lot easier to explain to the West, but in reality was based on the I Ching. And the reason why, in no small part, I believe that he didn't share this as part of his therapy is the same reason why I don't do readings for others, is because when you're accessing your own intuition, you can't have somebody else do the reading. So, what I'm looking to do is learn what Carl Jung's method of accessing the I Ching was, share that, improve it, and teach it to the masses. Right? Because it doesn't have to be the I Ching. That's my take. It can be almost any guide if it's relevant. I mean, because I was just listening before I started the podcast, was actually listening to a book that Carl Jung used in the Red Book as an example of what could be a guide. It's The Imitation of Christ by, of course. For the life of me, I'm never going to be able to remember that here. Where is it here? Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. And so from that, I realized that, you could make almost any. It could be the Bhagavad Gita, because in his lectures on Kundalini, Jung admits that right? He was using the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali just because it was a little easier to access. Within the Upanishads, we have the same teachings, the Bhagavad Gita. Because, I used Thus Spake Zarathustra as my guide long before I discovered the Bharath Fadul. Or, as I've always said, when people have asked me what's a great guide, even a Cliff Notes or a Cole's Notes to Buddhism, I recommend the Prana Paramita Hridaya Sutra, the Heart Sutra, or the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, or the Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom. Because, it's only, I guess, arguably how many pages long? And it's barely more than one page, right? The particular Heart Sutra I have out doesn't have page numbers. Paragraph number. It has page numbers, so that's what threw me. It depends on the translation. In Chinese, it's only got, what is it here? 260 characters. That's it. It's more words in English, Sanskrit, but it doesn't get much shorter than that. So I've always recommended that as your way to access.